So I welcome Kate Edwards, Director for Global Game Jam, and the CEO of Geography, who's kindly consented to give us a wonderful presentation on building better worlds through game culturalization, a very interesting topic, a need of the hour. I also welcome our Dean, PK Parthasarthi, who has spent several days putting this together, and we're thankful to him. I welcome my worthy colleagues and the students for whom we all of this together. Kate is one of the leading names when it comes to game and game design. She's considered amongst the top 10 women in game design. And of late, she was also, recognized and awarded by various organizations. She served Microsoft for a very long time and then went on to launch her own organization, Geography. She's also been a consultant for BioWare, Google, Amazon, Facebook, and Lego, and several other companies. What is most interesting about Kate is that her primary education has been in geography, and it eventually went on to become a calling towards gaming. So we're going to hear something about that, how the transition happened from Kate herself. She's a fan of Star Wars, so I would say during this presentation, may the force be with her. And to you, Kate, we, Chitkara University, are a leading private university in the north of India. Do you know Chandigarh? Do you know where we are?
Yes, I've
Oh,
actually been to Chandigarh. I know it
oh,
well.
oh, great, wonderful, wonderful. Did you enjoy your trip? When
I
was it?
did. No, it was a long time ago, actually. It was that way back. It was 20 years ago, back in 2000. I visited Chandigarh for a geopolitics conference. And
Oh,
it was great. I had a fantastic experience. And we went to Amritsar and then over to Lahore. And it was a great opportunity. That's back when I was still working at Microsoft.
how interesting. That was perhaps the transition phase of Chandigarh. We were becoming an IT hub at that point in time,
Mhm.
and that uh, phase has pretty much taken off wonderfully. And this is the breeding ground of a lot of IT consultancies and professionals. So we hope to have you back here soon and host you sometime in the near future when things are better.
Yes,
And
I would love to visit again.
great, wonderful, Kate. So, without much ado, I think we should go ahead and start with the presentation. We're looking forward to this amazing session, culturalization, which is something India, is an integral part of in the whole global sphere. And I'm
Mhm.
sure you're going to throw in more light from the gaming perspective. So, over to you, Kate.
Definitely. Well, thank you so much again. I'm honored to be speaking to you today. And yeah, I did not actually realize that you're in Chandigarh, so that actually makes me feel even closer to you because since I've been there, even though it was a long time ago, but it was a fantastic visit I had there at a conference at the Punjab University, and so yeah, I had a great time. So yeah, I have been in the game industry for over 27 years now and working professionally as a geographer and cartographer in the IT sector for about 30 years. And like you mentioned, I was at Microsoft for 13 years where I created a special team inside the company called geopolitical strategy. So my job was to protect the company from geopolitical and cultural risks that get them into a lot of trouble. It could be anything from maps to icon design to character design in video games and all kinds of other things. And then after I left the company in 2005, I created my own company. And then I've been consulting for all kinds of different organizations, like you mentioned, Google, Amazon, Facebook, all these small startup type companies. And but I've also been very active in a lot of advocacy work in the game industry, such as running the Global Game Jam, which I currently do in addition to my consulting work. And I also used to run the International Game Developers Association. But this topic, culturalization, this is my core expertise. This is what I do from day to day, working mostly in video games. There is a whole segment of my work, about a 25% or a third of my work is not involved in video games. It tends to be in geopolitics and cartography. And I am extremely familiar with all kinds of issues in India, like Ladakh and Jammu and Kashmir and Arunachal Pradesh, and I could go on and on. But that's not what we're talking about today. What I am going to talk about, though, is how we adapt these amazing game worlds like this world of Skyrim. When we see a game like this where it has been realized so well, and it's just such a beautiful game with a great environment and everything, and everything that went into this game, the amount of effort to make it feel like a real place. There's a tremendous amount of world building that happened here, not just the narrative, but also the gameplay experience and all the lore and everything else that went into this world. And really, every game that we play has those actions. There's a focus on narrative. There's a focus on action, even experience, like the games Halo. Like I worked on all the original Halo games when I was at Microsoft, and I still love playing Halo. But yeah, this is a world that takes place in our universe, although it's in the far future. It's very, sci-fi, science fiction, but yet there's a lot that went into the development here. Or games like No Man's Sky, where all the rules about world building were actually coded into the game. So everything in this game is procedurally generated. So as you explore the universe in No Man's Sky, you basically are seeing things that nobody else has ever seen because they never existed before, because the procedural generation. And that's actually a really cool method for world building today. Or even something like Smash Brothers. This, people say, well, this is just an arcade game. Well, even games like this is a world that has been built for a specific reason, and it's been populated with specific characters, and there's a whole reason for this existing. Or, of course, games like Grand Theft Auto 5, which you may recognize this as the city of Los Santos, the fictional city. I'm actually from Los Angeles originally, and so they did an amazing job of replicating Los Angeles, but making it just different enough so that it's not Los Angeles, but it's something what I call hyper real. It's very close to reality, but it's not reality. Or, of course, games like Assassin's Creed, where they take a very real place with real history, and then they overlay a fictional narrative on top of real history and real geography, which is also one of the things I really love about the Assassin's Creed series. And of course, Minecraft, games like Minecraft, this is all about world building. That's what you do in Minecraft. And so it's all about learning about resource management, how you build things up and tear them down. Of course, there's a narrative that has also been built into Minecraft as well. But a lot of even simple games, quote, simple games like mobile games, a lot of people assume that games like this game Limbo that came out a few years ago is really simple. There's not much story here, not much world building, but there's a tremendous amount of work that goes into this, even if you don't see it all right on the screen. And even if things like Angry Birds, which has been so phenomenally famous, Angry Birds too has a lot of world building that went into it, and there's a whole narrative here too about like birds versus pigs and all that. That the company Rovio has explored through other media like graphic novels and movies and other video games. So what's interesting is that when we do all this world building, we create all these worlds. A lot of what we do in video games today has a foundation in literature and has foundation in a lot of science fiction, fantasy writing. For example, a lot of you may recognize this map, and I hope you recognize this map because this is from J.R.R. Tolkien's Lord of the Rings books, and which I think a lot of us have read. Now, this map is actually the inspiration for me for why I became a cartographer, because I loved the idea that he took cartography, which is a real world science, and he used it to create a completely fictional place. So he did this for the sake of his books, whereas we do the exact same thing with our games as well today. And, so much work has gone into this, and he built his world on the basis of one of his creative strengths, which was a command of language, because Professor Tolkien was, he was a professor of language. And so he created the language for the dwarves and the elves and the black speech and all these other languages in this world. And he built the cultures around the languages, which is very similar to what you see in our world, in our reality. And so by doing this, he really brought this world to life. And then he added this geography with it to really give it a sense of reality that you would normally just not have. In a lot of fantasy books, what's interesting is that every fantasy book that has come along after Tolkien, a lot of them do the same thing, like the Chronicles of Narnia. They put a map in there because using a map kind of brings us a sense of reality, because we, in our world, when we look at a map, we assume that it's reality. We assume that there's a fact about the map that we're looking at. And so fantasy writers and sci-fi writers and game creators all use a similar technique as part of their world building to kind of evoke this sense that this place is real. And not only is it real, but the author or the creator is actually, in a way, by using this fictional map, is trying to say, I was there. I actually went to this place, and it's so real that I'm able to describe every detail, and then I actually have a narrative that takes place in this world. So there's a whole story I'm going to tell you about what I saw when I was there. Now, of course, that's all fiction, but we use the same technique in most creative media, whether it's film, whether it's television, whether it's video games. We use this idea of combining a tremendous amount of world building, sometimes using maps and other techniques to bring that world to life. And so my job, what I do, is essentially help these game creators bring that world to life in a way that makes sense, in a way that's going to work everywhere that game is going to be played around the world. Now, what's interesting is that, what we often see, that places that are used in our world, the real places, are used for like movie sets. So this is a map of places that were used around the world to film the Star Wars series, at least through episode 7. Now, you can ignore the population of Jedi. I'm not talking about that today. But these are locations used around the world, and these locations in the world actually take on their own fiction because they become so famous in the movie that people see that place as the fictional location. For example, if you're a geek like me, when you visit Tunisia, you go down to southern Tunisia and visit the original Lars homestead that was used in the first Star Wars film. Or when I'm in Dubrovnik, I recreate scenes from Game of Thrones. Or a couple years ago, before I went to Gamescom in Germany, I had to give a talk in Ireland. So while I was in Ireland, I went out to this island called Skellig Michael, where they filmed scenes from some of the later Star Wars films, some of the more recent ones. So yes, as you might imagine, or you probably are guessing, I'm a total geek. So not only am I a geographer, I'm a huge geek. I love Star Wars, but I love a lot of other things too. This is how much of a geek I am. I actually cosplay a lot as well. So now you know I'm a total geek. And so part of the reason is because that's my daughter there on the right. She's actually a costume designer, a professional costume designer. So that's one of the reasons why I love to cosplay. But anyway, that aside, what I'm here to talk about, though, is culturalization. Now, why is this important? Why do we care about this? Well, partially is because if you look at this latest data about global gamers and where they are located, what's really important about this chart is to see these year-over-year growth numbers that I've highlighted, where you can see here that like the Asia Pacific region is the fastest growing region. And just a couple years ago, China surpassed the US as the largest gaming market in the world. And that's a major shift because a lot of game developers I know continue to make their games thinking like, I want to sell this in the United States, I want to sell it in Canada or Western Europe, where they think that because those are where they think that's where all the money is. Well, there's still money to be made in those markets, but the reality is the fastest growth and where the most players are growing is in a lot of emerging markets in Asia and Pacific, in Latin America, and the Middle East. So you can see even in North America, the growth was actually negative, almost 1% decrease over the last year in terms of the total gamers. And so that's why when I talk to developers about the kind of game they're going to create and who they're creating it for, what I'm trying to help them understand is that there's a huge world out there that is begging for content. They want new game content. They want really interesting stuff to play. And instead of focusing on like the Western markets as the typical market, we need to be thinking about the entire world as the market. Now, I'm sure you've heard the term localization before. Most of us have. And to me, localization basically means language translation. So you're taking the text and you're translating the text into another language. But culturalization actually is something that happens deeper, at a deeper level. It's not just about language. It's about a lot of the aspects of the product. It could be the icon design. It could be the user interface. It could be the color usage. There's a lot of other factors that go into culture beyond just language. And so what I've seen a lot of companies doing in recent times is that they're actually taking this step, the culturalization step, and designing their content for local and global audiences and to try and make that connection between their culture and the game, or their culture and whatever media they're creating. So it's not just about making a film or making a game and then translating it. It's actually about designing the content for that multicultural audience right from the start. And so here's an example of the difference between those two concepts. So here's a Kit Kat candy bar, which you may have seen. And so the Kit Kat bar, this is one that's strawberry flavored. And the one on the top is from Canada. So you can see the label is in French and English. And the bottom one is from Japan. So the label is in Japanese. Now, these two products are essentially the exact same product, but they're in a different wrapper with a different language. So that's basically localization. It just makes concept legible. But in Japan, they've taken the Kit Kat candy bar and have made it something completely different that you will not find in any other country. And what they've done is two things. One of the things the makers of the candy bar did is they used the name Kit Kat to their advantage, because there's a phrase in Japanese, kitukatsu, which is like this very victorious, positive phrase. And so they were lucky that their name Kit Kat is very similar to kitukatsu. So they were able to use that in their marketing. The other thing that they were leveraging is the fact that in Japan, a lot of people love to collect things. It is a collector culture. And so what they did is decided to make all of these different kinds of flavors of Kit Kat that are regionalized flavors. So like in Hokkaido, in the North Island of Japan, there's flavors that they like there that are different from Tokyo. And so they leverage these two cultural aspects, the name and the collector culture, which, that the collector culture, by the way, you shouldn't be surprised that a game like Pokemon comes from Japan. The whole idea, you got to catch them all, that fits in very well with Japanese culture. And so you can actually travel around Japan and collect different flavors of candy bars, Kit Kat bars around the country. And this is something that only exists in Japan. It's very unique to that country. And so that's an example of culturalization. Now, there's two types of culturalization that we often deal with. The first is what I call reactive culturalization. And so that's where basically I'm looking for things in the game that might cause a problem. So it could be anything. It could be a gesture. It could be a character design. It could be a story. It could be the use of history or religion or something else. So I'm looking for anything that might be a potential issue. The other one is proactive culturalization, where I'm looking for things that will actually enhance the experience for the game player. So, for example, when I worked on Forza Motorsports, we actually added cars that were tailored to specific languages. So like for German, the German players by default got mostly German cars because that's what they want to drive. Whereas like in the US, by default, most of the cars they got were like American muscle cars, like the Corvette and sorry, this thing moved automatically, like the Corvette and Mustang and a lot of American, what we call muscle cars. So there's two types that we take. So here's a couple of examples. So you may recognize this. This is from the game Fallout 3, and this was a Brahmin bull that appeared in Fallout 3, and this is the reason why this game did not sell in India, because there was concern that this depiction of the Brahmin bull was going to be offensive, to the faith there. So we basically, to the Hindu faith, of course, and so we decided that we were just not going to do this. Now unfortunately, we were trying to get the developer to change it to make it something like my poorly Photoshop two-headed horse, but they didn't have the time to do it. They were up against a very tight schedule. So unfortunately, they did not change the Brahmin bull, and this is why the game did not sell in India for this one reason. Now, proactively, you may have remember this if you were around that Marvel created this version of Spider-Man India, which I know, at least from my perception, from what I heard, the initial reaction was somewhat positive. However, what people really wanted, what they preferred would rather have a multi-language localization of the original Spider-Man, Peter Parker in New York City. Because this is what's difficult. If you're using a very familiar character where everyone knows it's Peter Parker, a lot of people would prefer to just have a localized version of this character rather than have a culturalized version who's totally different. So I know there's mixed opinions on whether or not this was successful, but it was a good attempt. They were making a good attempt at being proactive. So basically what I'm trying to do when I'm doing my work is taking the game worlds that are being created and seeing how they are compatible with local worldviews in all these different markets. And so basically it's sort of this gene splicing exercise where I work in this zone where I'm looking for content assets that are either going to be compatible or incompatible with that local market, whatever it might be. It could be politically, culturally, spiritually, whatever it might be. I'm looking for things that could be problematic, or like I said, things that might actually make the experience better for a specific market. So oftentimes when I'm doing this kind of work, one of the things that's different with culturalization compared to localization is that localization often happens later in the product cycle because you're waiting for the final text to be finished so you can actually begin translation. However, my work, a lot of my culturalization work begins very early. So like, for example, if I'm working on a BioWare game, like I've worked on pretty much all the BioWare games of the last many years, I will sit down with them right from the start and I will look at the concept art. I will read the draft of the script and I will try and understand in discussions with the artists and the writers and the producers, what is the world you're making? Who is in it? What do they do? What is the player going to do? What do they experience? So I get an understanding of all the aspects of the world that they're making. And at that stage, I can make really easy course corrections for them. I can give them advice to not do things or to do other things that is really easy for them to change because they haven't started work yet. And then as the work gets started, then I do spot checks throughout the development cycle. And eventually, we get to the end of the product cycle where there should be no surprises whatsoever. Now, there's many considerations when you're doing this work. It's just not looking at something and saying yes or no. For example, we have to think about the company values and goals. Now, by corporate, I mean it could either be a large company, it could be a small startup with 3 people, it could be just you working alone, but you have to decide what your values and goals are, because those will be kind of be your compass on whether or not you're going to change something. Like if you release your game or release your content into a certain market and you're hearing from them, like on Twitter, for example, they say, we don't like what you did. Well, you have to decide, am I going to stick by my creative vision or am I going to change it? The other thing is the context in which content is generated is very important. And I will come back to this point later. Also, the business strategy for the vertical. And so what I mean by this is like larger companies like for example, Microsoft and Sony, they don't make just games. They make all kinds of other things beyond games. And so they have to strategize on what they're basically, how are the games comparing to their other businesses. They also have to think about market strategy for a specific location like China or India, and also market strategy for a specific game like World of Warcraft. And then, of course, there's all the changing geopolitical and cultural factors out there, because as we have been taught, very clearly in the last few months, that the world is a very dynamic place and things can change very, very quickly. And so we have to be thinking or be watching for those changes. For example, 2 years ago, the German review board of the video game review board in Germany, called USK, decided that Nazi symbology is now okay to put in some games. So these are pictures from the game Wolfenstein 2 that came out a few years ago, and you can see the images on the left are what we saw in most of the world, but the images are on the right are the ones that were shown in Germany, because they're not allowed to show Hitler and they were not allowed to show the swastika. So now that rule has changed a little bit, so that is going to affect the kinds of games that you can release into Germany. And so that's the kind of thing you have to watch for. And it's one of the things that I do is I look for these kind of changes. Now, let's talk about world building and essentially what does it take to actually build a world? And there's a few key things, core aspects I want to talk about. So first is setting the context of the world, whether it's in the real world or a fictional world. The other part is complexity. How much world do you need to build? And then also the structure, creation of the elements inside that world. So I'm going to explain all of this. So let's first talk about the context. So real world and fictional world. Now, as you probably saw from my earlier examples at the beginning of this talk, it's not just black and white like that. There's always this spectrum in between. So, for example, Grand Theft Auto 5, which I showed you, is what I called hyperreal. So that's very close to the real world, but it's not the real world, but it's very close to it because most everything in that game is like reality, but it's just a little bit different. Whereas something like the game Skyrim is completely fictional and has nothing to do with our reality. And so most games fall somewhere in there, and they might fall on either side. Or there's a game like, a game like Assassin's Creed. It is the real world, but then it's in the future or the past. In the case of Assassin's Creed, it's in the past. Whereas in the game of Halo, it's in the future, but it's in the real world. Also, I wanted to make a clarification. When I use the word realization, what I'm talking about is not realism. So realism is talking about like how realistic does it look? Like Skyrim, it looks very photorealistic. But that's not what I'm talking about. When I'm talking about realization, I'm talking about how much world do you need to build in order to basically bring your creative vision to life. And there's two key things you have to think about for determining that realization. The first is the narrative goals. So what's the story you're trying to tell? And then the other thing is the experience goals. What is the player actually doing in your game? And so those two things combined essentially give you the basis for what the realization goals are. Those two things are kind of your guiding light to tell you this is how much world that you need to create. So so let's talk about how you actually realize worlds and some of the tools that we use. And I'm going to explain all of these in detail, so don't worry. So the first thing is building cultural evidence inside your environment. The other thing is ensuring logical consistency, implying complex systems, and then establishing some familiarity through the use of thematic layers. And again, I'm going to explain all of this right now. So cultural evidence, what do I mean by that? Well, basically, if you create a game environment, like some of the examples I showed at the beginning, there's all kinds of things in that environment. It could be the costumes, it could be the buildings, it could be banners hanging on the buildings, it could be boxes sitting in the corner. It's artifacts, things that people carry, things that people might wear. It's basically anything that fills up the environment. And so what we're trying to do is create the minimal amount of content to convey the presence of the in-game culture that you've defined in your creative vision. And so the problem with this activity is that oftentimes this is what happens during that main production phase of the game, so that once everybody knows what the vision is and they have the concept and they all agree on the concept, then they kind of go heads down and they just start creating stuff, very quickly, as fast as they can. And this is what we call backfilling the game with content. And during the backfilling phase, so this is like when the environmental artists will get a list and they'll say, here's all the different environments that I need to build over the next few months. And so they're going to be working as hard as they can to get these environments done on schedule and on time. And so a lot of times that doesn't give them the chance to sit back and think about really clearly what exactly they've created. And I've seen this happen so many times where people are just so furiously working along every day, and hopefully they're not crunching, they're not working ridiculous hours. But they're working so hard and they've got so much to do that they often don't stop and think about what they're actually making. So there's two key tips here. One thing is we can't be lazy with our creation. We always have to create with a purpose, and I'll give you an example of that in a minute. And the other thing is somebody has to ask the hard, challenging questions. If someone creates something, you need to have an editor or somebody else who might say, so tell me why you created it like that. What does that mean? What does that symbol mean? Where did you get your inspiration from? Just questions like that. You're not challenging their creative capability. That's not what you're asking. What you're asking them is basically, how did you get to this idea? You already know that they're a great creative artist or a great writer or a great programmer because they wouldn't be working with you otherwise, right? So you're just trying to understand, how did they get that inspiration? So here's an example from the game Jade Empire that I worked on many years ago. And so you can see this environment where we've got these glowing blue cylinders in this hallway. Well, originally what these were, because this is kind of this whole game was sort of this pan-Asian culture that was a fantasy Asian game. So it didn't take place in the real world, but it had a lot of inspiration from Asian cultures, including India, Korea, Japan, and China. And what originally these blue cylinders were, they were prayer wheels from Tibetan Buddhism. And so we did not want to have prayer wheels in the environment because in the game there was no Tibetan Buddhism. And so we had to change it very quickly and turn it into these blue cylinders. But that's because the reason they were there is because the artists just decided, they were out doing research and they decided that prayer wheels fit with an Asian environment, so they put them in there. But that was really not that's not what we should have done. So then another idea is that we have to think about is logical consistency. Now, logical rules, we want logical rules to exist that are applied to everything that we create, to the space and time and all the elements inside that world. And we don't want there to be any contradiction between the narrative intent and the content that's in that world. So we want to make sure that everything we create, again, is serving those two things of the narrative purpose and the experience. So if we just start creating stuff that doesn't seem to fit there, then it creates a negative experience for the player. So here's an example of that as well. This was a game called Cameo that I worked on. And you can see here, there's these wooden crosses on the side of the road. Well, Cameo takes place in a completely fictional universe. So there's no Christianity in this universe. And so what these two crosses represented were grave markers that the artist had created. And I had to push back on them. And I asked them, why did you use wooden crosses? Because there's no reason they would have a wooden cross in this universe. And the artist said to me, what else would I use? And I said, well, I don't know. Maybe that's your job as a creative person to actually make a grave marker that would look appropriate for this universe. And eventually they did. But this is an example of lazy creativity where I think they were going down their list of things they had to make that day, and they saw a grave marker. And without thinking very hard, they just kind of threw a grave marker into the environment without thinking that this is not really an appropriate grave marker for this universe. So this marker is not logically consistent with the rest of the universe. And so therefore, it could be a potentially weird experience for players. The other thing that's really powerful to use is this concept of topology, which is a concept just like logical consistency is an idea that comes from geography. We actually use that concept of logical consistency in spatial database work. Topology is the same thing. That also comes from geography, because topology, it's not what topology is about how things are connected. So like right now, there's a topological relationship between you and I. I'm the speaker and you're the audience. That is a topological relationship. Whereas this is not topography. Topography is about elevation and distance, but this is about simply how are things connected in the environment or in any other way. And so oftentimes topology, when it's used in a narrative or used in the environment, we can convey the sense of a much bigger world without actually building that world. And so this is actually a very powerful tool that we can use. And let me give you an example that we used on the original Halo game. Like I said, I worked on this game, and one of the things that was really cool is that if you've played Halo, or at least you know about Halo, it's a first-person shooter. It's very linear, so you're basically running along the whole time, and you're just shooting things, and you often don't have time to stop and admire the environment or to even understand the environment you're running around in. And this amazing Halo ring that you discovered in the game was built by this race called the Forerunners, and you don't find that out till later versions of the game. But what was really cool is that the developers put what they call terminals into the environment. You can see here examples of the terminals. If you interact with them, it pops a screen and it has text that you can read. And that text basically gives you a whole bunch of backstory about the world as it was created. And so this is a really easy way to build the world out for the player without actually having to build like a whole nother level. They didn't have to build any characters. They didn't have to make any new environments. All they did was have this nice little Easter egg inside the game that if you happen to stop and find it, then you could find out a whole bunch of cool information about what you're actually doing in this world. So I thought that was a really cool technique. And that's an idea of topology. It's actually connecting the player to this much bigger sense of history just by using the simple technique of having a terminal. Now, in terms of, some people ask me a lot of times, like, why is a geographer working on video games? Because that doesn't seem to make any sense. Why does a geographer help with world building? And the reason I think geographers are very well suited for world realization is because our job is to deconstruct the world that as it exists out here. So we spend a lot of our time examining the world, and we deconstruct it so we can understand what's going on. And we use maps and cartography as our tool to understand. So when you see a map of the real world, that map is a reconstruction of the world. It's world rebuilding, as I call it. And the way we do that is we use a tool called Geographic Information Systems, which divides up the world into layers like you see in this diagram here. And so we think about the world in different thematic layers like elevation, land use, population, things like that. And with the GIS system, we can actually do analysis between those layers, which helps us have an understanding of the world. So I take these same concepts and I apply that to game creation, because as developers are creating their world, they should be thinking in terms of the layers that they need to realize their world. And oftentimes they don't think about it this way. So this is my way of trying to help them understand that, they need to basically narrow their vision of what actually needs to be built, because then one of the number one problems I've seen developers do on all the games I've worked on is they overcreate. They just make too much stuff when they don't really need it. And so here's an example of a bunch of thematic layers that goes into world building. Now, this is a very simplified list, and if I made this a very detailed list, it would probably go to the center of the earth. But you can see here all kinds of examples of different thematic layers you could add to the world. So for example, let's take the climatology one. That's climate and weather systems. I've seen a lot of games and I've worked on a lot of games that have a weather system, but a lot of times that weather system doesn't really affect your gameplay at all. It's only there for atmospheric reasons, but it doesn't really do anything. Whereas if you've played the latest Zelda Breath of the Wild game on the Nintendo Switch, that game, the weather system directly impacts your gameplay in a very meaningful way. And so that's really cool. So they spent all that time creating a very complicated weather system, and it actually, they put it to good use. Just like I've seen other games where they built an entire economy within their game, but then they never really used it. So that was kind of a waste of time. They just decided to make it because they thought it would be fun to make. But again, they're wasting their effort, they're wasting their money, because the goals of their game, the narrative goals and the experience goals, did not really dictate that they needed an economic system. So we have to think about, what kind of layers do I need if I'm going to make a game? What do I actually need to create the most minimal, workable version of my game, to bring my narrative to life and to bring the user gameplay experience to life? So I'm going to talk now about what I consider the most problematic thematic layers that I've had to deal with in my work, since I deal with a lot of political and cultural sensitivity in my work. So here's some of the layers that are the ones that have been most problematic. So the use of history, the use of faith, inclusion and exclusion. I will explain all of these. What I call intercultural dissonance, and then finally the geopolitical imaginations of different governments. That has to deal more with maps. So let's talk about history. So you've no doubt played a lot of historical games. I've worked on a lot of historical games. I've worked on all the original Age of Empires games. I'm currently working on Age of Empires 4 right now, which is super fun. And one of the things that's very evident is that history in a lot of countries is very persistent, historical memory. So for example, in India, where your history stretches back millennia, compared to here in the United States, which this country is only barely over 200 years old. So we don't really have a good sense of history in the United States. Whereas in places like India, China, Japan, the Middle East, there's tremendous amounts of history that goes back a very long way, and people have, that is part of the culture. So for example, when we were working on Age of Empires, this was the first Age of Empires that came out in 1997. So you can see here, this scenario, what you're seeing is that history tells us that the Japanese in blue, the Yamatos, they invaded the Korean peninsula over there in the red, and they basically tried to take over the Choson Empire, which was what it was called in Korea. And so they almost completely succeeded. So this was an overwhelming battle where the Japanese basically swooped into the Korean peninsula, and it was very difficult for the Choson Empire to survive. They did, but just barely. And so we decided to put this into the game because it would be a very difficult scenario to play as the Koreans. However, when the game was released, the Korean government said that this never happened. They said this history did not happen. And so we had to decide, what are we supposed to do? Because the Ministry of Information of the Korean government would not allow this game to be sold in Korea because they said it was historically inaccurate. And so we decided to have a long discussion on our side at Microsoft. What are we supposed to do about this? Well, remember that slide about multiple considerations, things we have to think about? Well, this is a great example of that. So at the time, Microsoft was still trying to grow its games business. The Xbox did not exist yet. So they were trying to grow their games on the PCs. It was very important for them to grow their market for the games. And then also we knew from market research that Korea was a very important gaming market, which it still remains true to this day. And we also knew that real-time strategy games like Age of Empires were extremely popular in Korea. And if you know anything about Korean game history, 1 year later, 1998, is when the game StarCraft came out, and StarCraft became a national phenomenon in Korea. And StarCraft is also an RTS game. So basically, all of these factors combined were telling us we have to sell this game in Korea. So what are we going to do? What we decided to do was create a special patch only for Korean players that changed history. So you can see what happened instead of the Japanese invading Korea, the Koreans invaded Japan instead. This never happened in history. And so yeah, this was controversial on the development team. We had a lot of discussions about the nature of truth and about ethics of changing history. But we also had to remember that these games, the history is very, very generalized. It's not supposed to be super accurate. The history is a backdrop for fun gameplay. And so a lot of the history in Age of Empires is highly generalized or simplified for the sake of the gameplay. The other thing that we also have to remember is that when I was working at Microsoft a few years earlier, I was working on a product called Encarta Encyclopedia, which was the precursor to Wikipedia. And in Encarta, we had to have different heights for the mountain Mont Blanc, which is on the Italian-French border, because at the time, Italy and France did not agree on the exact height of the mountain. It was only off by a few centimeters. But they didn't agree on the height, so we had to have different heights in the different versions of an encyclopedia. So what we were doing is serving different facts to different viewpoints, which were reinforced by the local government. And this is another example of that has to deal with history. And of course, we mainly ended up doing it for business reasons. So the other thing is the use of faith. So of course, we deal with a lot of cultures that maintain their core expectations based on religious beliefs, and we need to be sensitive about that when we release content. So for example, both of these games got in big trouble because they had audio files that contained lyrics from the Islamic Quran. And so for various reasons, these games got in, various levels of trouble. The one on the left, which I actually worked on, that game was eventually banned worldwide and was globally recalled because it got the PR, the public relations news about it got so negative, especially in the Middle East, that there was no way we could sell this game. And so it was unfortunate. And it all happened because somebody did not check one audio file. They did not check what the lyrics were actually saying and what the source of those lyrics were. And so if you're ever going to use music or anything like that, just a warning, make sure you check the source, because that can really be a big problem. Imagine putting 2 or 3 years of work into a game and having one audio file take your game out. Also, like this game, Resistance Fall of Man, which came out a few years back, they recreated the Manchester Cathedral in the UK in fantastic detail. But what they did is that they actually destroyed part of the church during the gameplay, and the Church of England did not like that. They were not amused, and so eventually the Church of England created what they call sacred digital guidelines, so that if you ever want to use a Church of England facility in a game or anything else, you have to get their permission before you can actually use it. And I can guarantee you, if you're going to destroy their facility, then they will not let you use it. Or something very close to home here, where the game Hitman 2 took their action into the Golden Temple in Amritsar. And, they basically were, this main character of the game was killing Sikhs in their most sacred spot. And yeah, this is very inappropriate. This is something that we should not be seeing in a video game. And so they found out when the game was released, they got a lot of pushback about what they did, and rightly so, because this was a very poor decision on the game maker's part. Now, the other category is inclusion versus exclusion. And what I mean by that is when people perceive that they are being treated inequitably, like they are being excluded from the experience on the basis of their culture or their nationality or their ethnicity or their gender or for some other reason. This is kind of a very large category of things. So, for example, when Resident Evil 5 was about to come out, you can see here they released images of this white male who was shooting these sub-Saharan African villagers. And you might, so a lot of people were, especially in the West, in the US in particular, because racial relations is still a very sensitive topic, as you know. They saw this imagery and were very upset by this because they said, why is this not nice guy, but why is this white guy shooting these black people in Africa? Now, the developers said it's because they're zombies, and you can see that image on the right. They are zombies. However, what they didn't realize, the developers did not realize, is that this relates to very ancient, old imagery that's very negative, and from 100 years ago during the Victorian era and elsewhere, where this is imagery that we have rejected at this point in history, and we don't appreciate this imagery. Now, you may wonder, why did the developer do this? Why did they not see this? This is where that point I made earlier about the context in which content is generated is very important, because this game was created primarily in Japan, where it's 98% ethnic Japanese. The Japanese people do not have the same idea of diversity as we do in somewhere like the United States or Canada or elsewhere. And so at one point back during my Microsoft career, I actually had to go to Japan and explain diversity to some of the teams there from a Western perspective so they could understand what we were talking about. And this is one of the reasons why this happened, because the Japanese developers, when they saw this, they didn't have the context for understanding why this is sensitive. Now, that doesn't excuse their behavior. They should have done their research anyway, but they learned a lesson. They learned a hard lesson. Or games like this, where you have these indigenous people from the Pacific Islands, and they're depicted in a very negative way, with a bone in their hair and sharp pointy teeth and a grass skirt. This is also a very antiquated idea of what native people look like. And the whole reason for this game is you basically torture them. You act like a god, and you torture them, and you punish them, and all the kinds of things. Now, the developer, they were getting a lot of pushback from Polynesian cultural groups, and they said, this is a specific culture. And the developer said, no, it isn't. It's just fiction. There's nothing here that's real. However, if you see that one object on the right side of the island, that is a moai that exists only in one place on Earth, which is Easter Island in the Pacific Ocean. And so by using that one cultural object, they instantly made this a specific culture. And so in later versions of the game, they actually changed it to a different statue so that they kind of made that, they disassociated from the real object, because they realized they made a big mistake. And then also things like gender depictions. So I use Tomb Raider as an example because this character, Lara Croft, has gone from what I consider to be extremely sexist depiction over there on the left when she first started out many years ago. And now in her latest iteration in the game, like I worked on Rise of the Tomb Raider a few years ago, I think now she's fantastic. Now she's a very realistic looking, not only her look, but also getting a great writer like Rhianna Pratchett to give life to the character and give her emotional depth in a way that the earlier versions of the games did not do. And so this character has evolved from being what is considered to be a very sexist depiction to someone who's actually very realistic and actually a very positive depiction of a female character in a game. The other category is what we call intercultural dissonance. And so this is basically where there's a tension between two or more cultures for all kinds of reasons. It could be historical, it could be political, it could be other things too. Now I'm going to use another Age of Empires example from Korea just because it's a good example. But this box art, it was used for Age of Empires 2, and it was rejected by a lot of Korean retailers at the time. And the reason they rejected it is because of the Japanese samurai being on the box. And you might wonder why. I mean, there is cultural tension between Japan and Korea, but why did they reject this at the time? The reason is because in the middle of the Sea of Japan, which is called the East Sea by Korea, there's a disputed islands called Dokdo, which is called Takashima in Japanese. And every once in a while, the two countries have a rise in tensions over this geopolitical dispute. And so this game came out right at the height of one of those tensions. And so because of that geopolitical tension over the disputed island, pardon me, the Korean retailers did not want anything Japanese showing up on their shelves, including this box with the samurai on it. And that was unfortunate because it had nothing to do with the game's content at all. It had everything to do with real-world geopolitics. And so when the expansion pack of this game came out, most of the world got to see this version with Montezuma front and center in the box. But then we made a special version for Korea only that has a Korean general on the box, because that was sort of our way of making up the mistake for them and showing the players that we love you, we still appreciate you. So we gave them a special box cover. Also, things like gestures are very sensitive. So I worked on all the Dance Central games, and you could see here some of the gestures being done, like the character on the left, he's doing this, but that's very similar to this, which is the same as the middle finger, which is the same as this gesture in the UK and the Commonwealth. And you can see she's doing this gesture, which usually means rock on. So it's positive, it's associated with rock and roll. But in Italy, that gesture means I'm sleeping with your wife. So you have to be extremely careful with gestures. They are very, very sensitive and very, very culturally specific. Even within a country, the gestures can have different meanings. And so we have to be careful about that kind of thing. Finally, there's the category geopolitical imaginations, and this is often when governments will reinforce what they consider to be their territorial sovereignty, what they control, even if they don't. These games, Hearts of Iron, were both banned by China because Tibet and Taiwan were not being shown as Chinese territory. And these games are like the board game Risk, if you've ever played that game, where you're trying to take over the world one territory at a time. And you can see how China's divided up into all kinds of different territories, but the Chinese government was very concerned that Taiwan and Tibet were not being shown the same color and the same as China. And so they banned the games because of it. And what's interesting, though, is that the games take place in World War II, and the People's Republic of China did not come into existence until 1949, 4 years later. And so they're basically reinforcing their concept of their sovereignty before they even existed. But then again, we all know what China is doing in the South China Sea right now, so it's not surprising necessarily. But I'm going to not get into politics right now. Another thing that happens is something like this when you're doing an option screen. When I worked on Ninja Gaiden, and you could see how that one line says country select, and it has the Taiwan flag, and then it says ROC. Well, ROC stands for Republic of China, and so that is a term that is forbidden to use in China for Taiwan. And the Taiwanese flag is also forbidden to use in China. So this one little line here is a very, very strong political statement, because you're saying that the Republic of China is a country, and here's the flag. So this will get you instantly banned in China to use this. So what we do instead is we change it, as you can see now. We take the flag away because it's redundant information. We use the term Taiwan instead of Republic of China because Taiwan is acceptable to both sides. And then we also say country/region, because then you may not have confusion. So is Taiwan a country or a region? That's not for you as the creator to decide. That's for you, the user to perceive. So if they happen to favor China's viewpoint, they'll say Taiwan is a region. If you're very pro-independence in Taiwan, you may say Taiwan is a country. But see, again, that's not you don't need to decide that. You're just trying to make sure that this is compatible with both locations, which now in this form, it's compatible to send this game both in China and Taiwan. So finally, as I wrap up here, I want to just conclude on a few key points. First is the target audience. So generally, I see two target audiences for game content. The first one is what I call the intended audience. So these are basically people who like playing games. They play a lot of games. And, honestly, these people, they really don't care that much about most everything I've been talking about in this entire lecture. What they care about is if the game is good or not, or if the game sucks or not. That's really all they're focused on. The unintended audience, however, these are people who do not play games, and these are often the people who will take things out of context. So a lot of times these might be government officials or other people who are not related to the game industry, and they see like one screenshot from a game and about something that they think is sensitive. They're like, oh, this game is terrible, we have to ban it, video games are evil. And unfortunately, we see that reaction still happening in different places around the world. And so when it comes to my culturalization work, most of the reactive or proactive work I'm doing is to help the intended audience have a better experience, to have a more culturally relevant experience, because we already know that they love playing games. The reactive work is mainly to make sure that the unintended people are not doing a knee-jerk reaction and having a negative reaction to the video game with that they may not understand exactly what's going on. And so that's basically a way to kind of think about proactive and reactive culturalization. The other things I think are really important to think about is distribution in the content cloud, because we know today that most everything that we release is instantly out there in the world. So it's instant exposure and it's instant to a global multicultural audience. So basically anything you release today is everywhere. It's already out there. It's probably on a DVD and on the streets of Shanghai tomorrow morning, literally tomorrow morning. That's just the way the world works now. And so basically, once you release something, it's out there and you cannot fix it, you cannot take it back. And also, we know that because of the online communities are very, very active, as we know on social media. So if you do something that they really love, you're going to get this huge outpouring of support and appreciation. But if you do something that pisses them off or makes them angry or offends their culture, you're going to hear about it. And you'll hear about it for a very long time. They will not let you rest. And so it's a very difficult process to go through. And so you're going to have to be doing a lot of damage control. So you have to think very carefully about all of these issues before you release your content. And the other issue that's really important around this is that a lot of governments and cultural institutions are fighting for what I call the public mind share. So they're competing to see who's going to influence their people. This is the reason why the Great Firewall of China exists, for example, because they're trying to prevent external influence of their people. And unfortunately, Russia took that same step last year when they passed what's called the Sovereign Internet Law to basically make like a sealed off version of the internet within Russia. So it's a challenging issue. That's a much bigger issue than this talk, but it's one of the things that factors into some of the problems that I deal with in culturalization. And then finally, my last point I want to make is about freedom of creativity. I personally feel that you should be free to create anything you want to create. I don't care if what you make, but you can't expect that creative vision to align with the expectation of other cultures, because it won't, because the world is a very diverse place. And if so you basically, when you're making these creative decisions, you have to be extremely conscious of all the thought that's going into your world building, and make sure that you're creating with a purpose, and you're making sure that it's very intentional in what you're doing. And we often find ourselves as creative artists in this space where we're trying to be artistically free to make anything we want, but then we also want to make money off our work because we want to do this for a living. And so it's a struggle, because you're not going to have total creative freedom unless you're an artist and you don't care about making money, and you're just going to release your games to the world and you don't need to make money. Then you don't have to worry about anything I've said. You can create anything you want. But most of us are not like that. Most of us want to do this for a living. Most of us want to not only create something we're proud of, but we also want something that people are going to enjoy. They're not going to be distracted by all these political or cultural issues. And so we find ourselves in what I call this fulcrum of compromise, where we have to kind of decide what factors are more important to us as creative people. And it's going to be different from everybody. It's not, there is no right answer to this. It's just something that we have to be thinking about during the creative process and while we do world building. So there you go. I am done. So I think I have some questions.
Amazing, Kate. This has been such an insightful session. I mean, not just on gaming culturalization, but the various elements that are there from, social, political, religious, and so many aspects. Uh, this brings one point to notice, that soft power. For a long time, the American soft power through Hollywood was a great influence. Like as kids, we thought if we were to ever call cops here in India, we have to dial 911. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
that was the influence of American cinema, and so an Indian soft power in that context. I mean, our mythology, the rich history of mythology, and yoga, for that matter, is definitely
Mm-hmm.
taking over the world and will have a role to play. But you brought in a great perspective through game, from game and game design, and now I know why geography is important for game design.
Well,
Okay,
I like to think it is.
yes. Uh, I would like to invite some questions if we have. Mr. Parthasarthi, would you like to kick off? If there are any questions, let's go ahead and take it forward, please. There are already some students who wrote in some questions on WhatsApp to me, so definitely the buzz has been created.
Okay.
Uh,
You can no read out the questions, Rajesh.
just a moment.
I'm just waiting for a question.
Yeah,
I
there
think there
is
is one question.
one.
Yeah,
Yeah. Kate, can
one question
you
in
see the
the
question?
chat box.
Yeah, I've seen a couple questions there. One is what is the best game you've seen, which that's hard to answer. I mean, there's so many good games out there. I mean, there's games that I personally enjoy. I mean, some of the best games I've ever played. I mean, stuff like The Last of Us. I mean, the Elder Scrolls series. Honestly, games like Red Dead Redemption 2. It's a phenomenal game. It's just so much work has gone into it. But it's hard to pick one. I mean, I think there's a lot of really good games. So, um, and like I said, I'm still a Halo geek, so I love to play Halo. So when they made the Halo Infinite announcement last week, I'm just like, super excited. That other question, though, where do you see India as a game market is a great question because India is a very fast growing game market, actually. And it's one that I think more and more companies are starting to pay attention to. Just like the example I gave about Fallout 3, that happened about 10 years ago. And 10 years ago, the developers they didn't really see India as like a major market, so they kind of decided that they weren't going to worry about changing the game for the Indian market, which is really unfortunate because there's a ton of Fallout fans in India who would love to play the game. However, now if that issue happened now, I guarantee that they would fix it now because they understand that India's market is growing very quickly, and it's growing for two reasons. It's not just the fact that there's more game consumers in India, which we're seeing double-digit growth year over year, especially on the mobile side, because let's face it, most growth today is in mobile. It's not on consoles or not in PCs because most people can't afford a good gaming PC or a console. Like in places like Latin America, a game console costs more than double what it costs in North America. So people don't buy game consoles there. It's mostly on mobile and PC. But the other thing is that, of course, is like just like you've got your great university. I mean, there are a lot of great educational institutions in India that are producing really good talent for the game development ecosystem. Like I spoke at the Game Developers Conference in India in Hyderabad last year, and had a fantastic time there, and just met a lot of fantastic developers. And then I was actually spoken at an event in Pakistan as well earlier this year before the whole pandemic hit. And just in that region, there's so much talent because you have so many people coming from really good schools. And so to me, that's where I think the country's becoming better poised, not just to be a larger game consuming market, which it is, but it's also becoming poised to be a bigger game producing market, which to me is really exciting. Um, so question about how indie game developers from India can approach the international market. I think, that this is, I get asked that question a lot from a lot of different indie developers around the world, and the answer is usually the same. Of course, it has to start with a really good idea. You've got to have a good core idea. Otherwise, you don't really have much to stand on. But it really is about access to, basically the marketing. How do you get discovered in a universe where, like, on somewhere like Steam, where there are thousands of games on Steam, and so it's really hard to get noticed on somewhere like Steam. And so a lot of times what you have to do is look at what kind of game are you creating, what kind of people play the game that you're making, and reach out to those specific communities. You might have to do it on Reddit or Facebook or wherever you find them, but you kind of have to start with those specific communities. For example, I was talking to an indie developer recently who created something that it's not Minecraft, certainly. I mean, why would you compete with Minecraft? But it was a game that would be I think it would be very interesting to Minecraft players. It's kind of in that same genre. And so I encourage them, you should be going out and test playing your game with people who play Minecraft. So go out on the internet and seek out those Minecraft communities and see if you can get some people to start playing your game and get testimonials, get that community going. Because really what happens today with any game that gets released, any indie game, it's not about where you're making it from, whether it's India or anywhere else in the world. What matters is your community. Are you building a community around your game, no matter where they are? And basically the community means people who like your game and people who feel that your game has a lot of potential. So you have to build that community up and encourage the growth of that community. And the wider it is, and especially not just in India, but elsewhere, the better off you're going to be, because you can actually show to potential investors that, hey, I've got an audience already. I've got X many hundred or thousands of people who love this game. And so you need to have that player base and to kind of generate that excitement around what you're doing. And so that's a very important part of any indie game development. So that would be a key piece of advice. Let's see, what do you think about the Indian gaming scene? I mean, the Indian game industry. So I kind of touched on that a little bit already. Basically, what I would say there is that I see a lot of exciting stuff come out of there. I really do. And I think, obviously there's a very strong connection between India and a lot of other markets, because India has been such a powerhouse in IT development and continues to be, just like you mentioned earlier in the introduction, how Chandigarh has really started to become a hub of that as well, which I think is really exciting. That's one of the things that makes me want to go back and visit all the more. And so I think what is essential about any game development scene is that it's all about the ecosystem. And the ecosystem consists of the government, educational systems, and the industry. And so I know India's got, India certainly has the educational component, such as your university. And it also has the industry that has been getting started. I don't know, maybe you probably know better than I do how well the government is supporting these two factors. But those three pieces have to work together in order to really grow the ecosystem and to make it viable on a global scale. And so now government doesn't have to mean like the central government in Delhi. It could also mean just the local state. It could mean the city. Basically, if there's some kind of local government support that says we believe game development is important and as an economic activity and as a job producing activity, so we want to see it happen. And if that's not happening, if that kind of engagement isn't happening, then I think it's the responsibility of developers, wherever they are, to reach out to their government officials and show them what you're doing and show them how games really are, this really viable tech sector. And show them the numbers. You can show them that the game sector is the largest form of entertainment on earth. We make more money than film or music or live sports or any of these other forms of entertainment. So that might be impressive to them. And which platform is mostly used for playing games? Well, today it's definitely mobile. Mobile, and that's just in the last few years, but because we've got so many amazing smart devices now, but mobile has overtaken PC and console at this point, and it's just still kind of taking off. So if you look at the numbers, like there's statistical companies like Newzoo, you can take a look at some of their stuff to see the charts that they produce, that mobile is really taking over the world. That doesn't mean that consoles and PCs are going to go away completely. I don't think they'll ever go completely away. At least not in the next decade or so, but mobile definitely is where all the action is, and it makes sense, especially on the global scale, because like the socioeconomics, like I mentioned earlier, is that buying a console is really not something most people do outside of North America and Europe that much, because it's not economically feasible. It doesn't make sense. How to make a map for a game? What all basic elements should be considered? Well, that's a great question. So I don't have all the time I need to go into that topic, but basically, if you want to make a map for a game, one of the things that really helps is if you want your map to look realistic. And by realistic, I mean, do the mountains look like they belong there? Does it look like a river should flow there? things like that. I would take a look at some maps. Like, India alone has amazing topography. I mean, you've got the Himalaya, and everything up in the north, and you've got amazing, lowlands down south, and the geography of India is very diverse. So even just starting there, or anywhere else you want to start with, but basically take a look at like a physical map, how rivers flow, how mountains build, understand plate tectonics, things like that, because then you can make a map that's going to be somewhat realistic in nature. And I've actually helped quite a few developers with their maps where they've shown me they made a fictional map, but it's not, it doesn't make sense. But to be honest, even Tolkien's map of Middle Earth that I showed you in my lecture is not completely realistic either. Those mountains around Mordor that are at right angles, that doesn't make much sense to me, unless you can explain them with magic or something. I don't know. Maybe that's what Tolkien was thinking. So another question is, how do you know what you're going to do? What made you realize that what you are doing now is something you want to do for a living? That is a great question, because I hope it's obvious that I love what I do. I really do. I really enjoy my work. I enjoy talking to you about my work too. And when I came out of high school way back when, one of my aspirations was to be a conceptual artist for Lucasfilm because I wanted to work on a Star Wars movie. That was my goal, and I had the artistic skills, and I went into industrial design because I found out that a lot of the artists at Lucasfilm at that time, that was their background, was industrial design. And so I learned industrial design. I really improved my drawing skills to make like the storyboard art and all that conceptual art. But then I also had this huge passion for maps. I love maps. I love travel. I love culture. And so I just decided to go into the direction of geography, and I could still use my artistic skills in map making, of course. And that eventually I did my schoolwork, my bachelor's degree, my graduate degrees. And then while I was working here in the Seattle area at the University of Washington, that's when Microsoft contacted our geography department looking for a cartographer to work on Encarta Encyclopedia. And once I got pulled over into Microsoft, I learned how my skills as a geographer could actually help them a lot in all kinds of ways, including on the video games. So once I started working on the video games at Microsoft, that's when I instantly knew that all these things that I love games, I love geek stuff, creative stuff, I love maps, I love culture, all of that came together in doing the culturalization work on video games. And that when I started doing that, I knew right then that this is what I want to do for the rest of my life, as much as I can. So cloud gaming has clear synergy with game subscription services. It eliminates consumers' need to buy hardware, while subscription services eliminate the need to buy software. However, we don't expect usage of cloud gaming solutions to grow at the same pace as subscription services in 2020. So what are my thoughts? I think that is a great observation, and I think you're completely right. I honestly think that is the future, though. I mean, we are looking at a future where it will be, cloud gaming services. We still have a long way to go to get there. I mean, let's face it. I mean, the latest efforts by Google are Stadia is it's an effort. I'll just put it that way. We'll see how long it lasts. But I think it's worthy to try. And I think of all the companies right now that are poised to be successful in cloud gaming, I think Google is one of the best ones who could possibly pull it off. Amazon or Microsoft, probably the others. I think Microsoft is doing well with their Game Pass program. So I think it's going to be interesting to see how that evolves, but I really do believe that we are eventually moving more and more towards a platform agnostic gaming environment around the world. And I think companies are finally starting to realize that you can't, especially even with content exclusives on different Xbox, PlayStation, all that. I think that's going to go away pretty quickly in the near future, because it's just, you got to do what the people want, and what the people want is to be able to play basically any kind of game they want on any platform that they want as much as possible. And so it'll be interesting to see where that goes. How to handle game characters, sequences inspired by gods, religion, or local values? That's a fantastic question. So you have to be really, really sensitive about that, because I don't know if you've heard of the game Smite, which is a MOBA, massive online battle arena. But the game Smite, what they did is they took different pantheons of real gods. So they took the Norse gods, which are worshipped by just a few people. They took the ancient Egyptian gods, which are worshipped by a few people. And then, of course, they took the pantheon of Hindu gods, which are worshipped by, about 1 billion people. And they put them into the game. And I know a lot of people were very upset about that from the Hindu faith, because they felt that that was very inappropriate to see them, put in the game. And a lot of people were making jokes about the game, saying, why don't you just get it over with and put Jesus and Muhammad and Moses in there too, just have like this big religious battle. So I feel that what they did in Smite was really inappropriate, and they should not have done that. The Norse gods and Egyptian gods are ones, like I said, there's very, very few people who worship them anymore. And I can kind of understand their reasoning for doing that, because even stuff like Marvel Comics use the Norse gods in the form of Thor and Odin and Loki and all of them. So but you have to be very, very careful about using any real world religion. And even if you're creating a fantasy world and you're making up a fake religion, you also have to be very careful, because oftentimes the designers of these new, fictitious religions will base it on an existing religion. Like, for example, when I worked on all the Dragon Age games, the religion in Dragon Age, the main religious system, is very similar to Roman Catholicism, and it's kind of obvious in a way. And so we had to make a few changes to make sure it wasn't too obvious. That question, how much money do video game designers make? That really is an open question. It's all over the board, because it all depends on where you're living. Even in the US, it's going to be a lot different whether you're living in San Francisco or Seattle or LA or Austin, Texas, or New York City. The amount's going to vary quite a bit. So I can't really answer that easily. I know that you can Google that and find that out fairly easily, at least get some idea. But game designers tend to make in terms of the overall jobs within the game industry, they tend to make higher than average, just because it's such a core job to the game. It's like you can't make a game without the designer. Yeah.
I think, Kate, we do understand that it's almost midnight in Seattle, so I know all of us would be very tempted to ask you more questions, but I think we'll quickly come down to the last two questions before we wrap up. I think, I know we would want to go on, but we do understand it's
No,
pretty
it's
much
fine.
midnight.
Yeah, I'll answer just a couple more.
Yeah,
And I think you all saw. I think you saw my email at the beginning and the end. So if you have additional questions, or if you want to connect with me on LinkedIn and ask me questions, don't hesitate. I'm more than happy to answer questions after this as well.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'm more than happy. I mean, so let's see. I'm just going to skip down here. What are the points to be considered when a student wanted to participate in the Global Game Jam? Well, basically, if you want to participate in the Global Game Jam, it's open to everybody, anyone and everyone. You have to be over 18, but other than that, you're welcome to participate in the Global Game Jam when it happens in January. We do have basically the old model, or hopefully the same model, where we actually gather on site together at schools and other locations across the world. Because of the pandemic, we're going to have to probably have some level of both real and virtual sites. Normally we never do virtual sites, but we just finished last week. We finished our event for younger creators called Global Game Jam Next, and that was purely virtual because you can't do a live event right now. So we'll see, but basically there is no gateway, there is no strong criteria. If you have a desire to try and make games and to do it in that environment, doing a 48-hour game jam, then I encourage you to sign up, because we'll be opening signups later this year for the event in January. And I would say the majority of people who do the Global Game Jam are students. We do have a lot of professionals too, but most people who are college students. So please consider it, because it's a lot of fun, and we see so many really cool games come out of it. So last question. I'm just the one about Last of Us 2 is a bit long, so I'm sorry. It's a great question, but I'm gonna skip it. So the last one is about how competitive is the job market. It's pretty competitive. It is a competitive market without any doubt. There's a lot of people who are wanting to get into games today. But that doesn't mean you shouldn't be discouraged by that. The way that you get into the job market is like a lot of job sectors today, sending a resume to a website is really not the best way to do it. The way to do it is you have to network with people. And that means, I think a lot of us in the game industry are introverts. You may not know it, but I'm an introverted person. I'm faking extroversion for this entire time. But I learned how to, be an extrovert to a certain degree. You have to get out there and network with people. I know it's difficult during the pandemic right now, but you can still do it. There's a lot of virtual groups online, game design groups and other groups out there. You can join them and introduce yourself, explain this is what I'm trying to do, or this is what I hope to do. Do you have any advice? It's really about connecting with other people who are already in the industry and see if you can find a mentor, see if somebody's willing to kind of coach you a little bit. Maybe you can show them some of the things that you've worked on and just get their feedback. You're not asking for a job. You're just asking them, hey, do you have a few minutes to give me some feedback on this thing I worked on? Because it would really help me out. And so you have to make those connections with people who are in the industry, because typically a lot of people who get jobs in this industry are people who were able to network well and basically connect with others at different companies. And I know it can be tough, but it takes a bit of effort. But that tends to help you stand above people who just only submit resumes or portfolios to a website, which is often a very challenging way to go. So the website for the Global Game Jam is really easy. So it's Global Game Jam, all one word, globalgamejam.org. So yeah, it's easy to find. And I will stop there.
Kate, if you could just take the last question, because it's come from PK, the dean, which is, what are your thoughts on Eurogaming? And we'll wind up after that.
Oh yeah, no, absolutely. That's a great question too. Sorry, I did not see that. So yeah, neurogaming is I think that's really exciting. I mean, I was advising anything that's related to that. I think is fascinating. Using kind of a direct interface. If there's any way that we can kind of tap into or bypass some of our sensory input, or use other forms of input that there's only now getting tapped into. Just like I was advising on a company that was making a haptic glove for VR, which is remarkable because the glove was not only haptic, it was also thermal feedback as well, and it was pretty remarkable to try. That whole frontier right now, I think that is where, when a lot of people ask me, where do you think the game industry is going in the next 10 to 20 years? And I think neurogaming, obviously VR and AR, haptic feedback, all of those kinds of technologies, I think are really kind of the next wave, because we'll always keep refining game design and the tools we use for game design. And of course, the platforms will continue to evolve. There's always going to be a better phone coming out, or a better PC or whatever. But what's really going to change is how we interface with the games and how we interact with them. And so I'm excited for that. I actually did my master's thesis in geography way back in 1991. I did it about using AR and VR for cartography. So I love those technologies. I have a lot of hope for them, but we'll have to see. It's taken 30 years for us to see something like the Oculus Quest come into existence. So I don't know. This could be another 30 years. We'll see.
Thank you, Kate. It was like heavy rain pouring today in India and in Chitkara University. Like we are also happy to say that we are already in developing the neurogaming process, where we have successfully developed one game where it's purely based on concentrations. So we have just taken a simple concept of an athlete game, and competing with the AI, and the guy who is paying just by his focus is increasing and increasing, the user level is also increasing from the leaping stage to the walk, and then to the run, and then running faster to win the race. So this was our first game with which we succeeded, and then we have stepped into the other neurogaming, which is triggering the brain points, where we are planning to do something very much equal to a PUBG. Rather than using your mobile or console, why don't you just play with the help of your brain, where we call it as a digital brain building.
Yeah,
So
that's awesome.
yeah, we also think that neuro gaming would be the future along with the virtual reality, and there are lots of AR glasses which has been popping out, and so recently the eyeglass they have shown the demo also, and
Mm-hmm.
I really wholeheartedly thank you very much that you have taken such a knowledge sharing really for 1 hour in the late night, which you have shared all your experience to our students, which the students would have really got benefited. And also one insight that you have said that many of the geography teachers see geography as in geography, but you have taken the geography to the other stage where the geography can be used in the gaming also, which is one most important aspect. So I really thanks for that. No, thank you once again. No, in future, we really being part of the Chitkara University, I expect we can collaborate in any ways so that it can be beneficial for the students and we can take the those students to the next level.
That's
Uh,
fantastic. Well, thank you
Really,
again. I had a great time. It was an honor for me to do this, and so yeah, I'm happy to do it someday in the future as well. And like you said, hopefully someday I'll get to visit again.
100%. You're most welcome.
Thank
Rajesh,
you.
over to you, Rajesh.
Uh, Kate, thank you for your time today. One of my favorite bands is The Doors, Jim
Oh yeah,
Morrison. Yeah,
yeah,
and I think they got their name because of this quote from Adolf Huxley, which says that if the doors of perception were cleansed, everything would seem as if infinite, and that
nice.
applies to gaming and gamification and the thought process. You have left an impact on each and every one of us here today. We leave this session today. Uh, bit more with bit more wisdom, towards how we perceive game and things in general. We can't wait to have you back, and we would, love to have you not virtually, but in
Yeah.
physical presence in Chandigarh, and would love to spoil you with our hospitality and show you other aspects of the city.
Well, thank you so much. I look forward to that someday. Let's hope. Let's hope the world gets past this quickly.
Hoping for the same. Thank you once again, and okay, thank you for staying awake late night and being with
I'm
us.
happy to. All right.
Thank you,
Well,
thank you,
take care.
Yeah,
thank you, everyone.
All right.
Thank
thank
you.
you. Thank you.
Bye
Bye.
bye.
Bye.